Hello and welcome to another in our series of Lent reflections, thinking about our journey into and beyond the wilderness. A few days ago I was watching a very good presentation of the Way of the Cross online. It was the meditation on Jesus' journey to crucifixion, and in this particular version, very thoughtfully, words and thoughts have been added to try and understand the personal experience of Jesus as he went through this extreme suffering. And I was very struck by something that was said at the point when he was being nailed to the cross, probably laid on the ground against the crossbeam as the nails were driven through his flesh. And the reader, the writer originally, made the observation that the wood, the nails, the hammer, all of these would have been such familiar things to Jesus. From his youth, working with Joseph in the family workshop, these would have been familiar implements that he'd have used with care, treated with great respect and tenderly, using skillfully. And now here they were, absolutely transformed in their purpose and in their use. And that helped me to think a little bit about this whole question of the wilderness experience as being transformative, as changing us from one position to another, hopefully in a rather more positive way than that particular case of the tools. We generally go into the wilderness aside from our normal life, and we come out of the wilderness again to go on living more or less in our normal life. It's not a whole life experience for most people. And therefore there is, in a sense, some expectation that we are changed by that experience, that when we come out of the wilderness, that we're not the same as when we went in. Something has happened to change us. For many of us, the wilderness experience may be no more than a little bit of this Lenten discipline. For others, it may be a lifelong struggle with something like spiritual darkness, emptiness, or perhaps mental health issues. For some, it will be the key defining point of their life, this journey in the wilderness. So it affects us all in different ways. But the perhaps underlying unity is this sense that the wilderness experience does have its effect on us. It is transformative. I remember I've always felt rather more affinity with those atheists who have really looked at and struggled with and questioned and ultimately rejected the Christian faith than perhaps those who simply won't look at it, think it's silly, or indeed those who have faith who perhaps haven't reflected on it. I suppose I identify with the idea of those who've really struggled, whether it's intellectually or emotionally, with what faith expects of us. They have at least made that journey. They've gone through that struggle, that questioning, whether they come out the other end as people of faith or as people who find it impossible to believe. And I think it's important that we do indeed face those challenges of faith, which ultimately enrich us. And if we look at the Bible, perhaps one of the cardinal examples of this is the story of the prodigal son, that famous and that wonderful story of the lost son, but which is actually a story about two sons. And it's interesting how in the story the older son, the dutiful son, really comes out of it quite badly. And of course, in a sense, he represents those who are observant but perhaps somewhat smugly self-satisfied in their religious observance, as opposed to the wayward son who comes to his senses and is embraced by the father's forgiving love. The power of the story comes from that experience, I think, of the son who goes away, who steps outside of the loving home, as it were, of his father's home, and only eventually, after realising the awful mistakes he's made, is able to come back and be reconciled. The older son hasn't had that experience of transformation, though perhaps in a way we get that at the end of the story, when he feels that he can't participate in the great feast of homecoming. Perhaps that's his own wilderness experience out of which a new relationship with father and brother will emerge. Transformation is often painful, and it happens because it requires us to lay ourselves open to being changed, perhaps not by anything extraordinary, but by subtle awarenesses and understanding and renewed grasp of what matters in life. It's as though the penny drops through our experience, something becomes clear which perhaps wasn't quite so clear before. We see things more as they really are. This is certainly the experience that many talk about who practice meditation, where in the Eastern tradition there's a great encouragement to, as it were, sit through and let go of the ordinary distractions of life, so that we open ourselves to seeing ourselves and the world as they really are, which is an obvious experience in one sense, but also can be a very profound one once all the layers have gone, all the artificiality has dropped away. And that can be achieved simply by focusing on the breath and letting all distractions fade away. That in itself is an everyday wilderness experience which one can, in a sense, enjoy from one's own armchair or prayer mat or meditation mat. And it's important, I think, that we do have that experience of letting go of the trappings and seeing life and ourselves a little more as they really are. And the wilderness experience, therefore, can be very challenging, but also actually very refreshing. And if we approach it that way, we're most likely to benefit from it. It's a time of listening. It's a time of being still enough to hear the obvious, as it were, to hear what is there all along, the gentle voice of God. And again, one can look at Jesus' example in his life, brought up in a faithful Jewish household. One of his earliest experiences would have been to hear repeatedly the words of the Shema, the great summary of the Jewish faith that begins, "Hear, O Israel." Hear, listen, observe. And that's something which would have been deeply entrenched in his own religious experience and in his life. And so it's perhaps no accident that when we read Matthew and Luke's accounts of the temptation in the wilderness, Jesus' response to the tempter is actually framed in terms of, hear, listen to God's word, listen and absorb it. And out of that listening, he's able to give good answers to the tempter. He's able to make that observation, both, again, common and profound, really, that human life is more than simply the physical sustenance of bread. He's listened sufficiently to God the Father to understand that our relationship with God is one neither of such dependence that we're always putting the sort of test to God to get us out of problems, but nor one of challenging, nor one of putting ourselves ahead of God. And so it's through that listening over the years of his youth that Jesus is able actually to encounter the tempter and deal with those temptations because of that awareness of the underlying tenets of his faith and his relationship with God. He's able to see himself in a right relationship with the Father. And yet, if we go back to the start of the story, if you like, to Genesis and the fall of humanity, we can see that listening doesn't always lead us in the right direction. So we have that wonderful, really quite stunning story of Adam and Eve, who are brought to life in the very presence of God, in communion with God, and yet who fall away. And why do they fall away? It is through listening. They listen, they are beguiled, they are tempted, and they hear a voice which isn't the voice of God, which challenges them. And their impulsive response leads them away from God rather than to God. And so I think that's a salutary reminder to us that we have to beware, to discern, to listen, and to take time. Listening isn't indiscriminate. We need to listen for the right prompts. And this was very much part of the experience of the desert fathers and mothers who, in their time of profound isolation, often experienced the awareness that the voices which seemed most pressing and most insistent were not actually the voice of God. The most powerful, the sort of loudest shouting voices were often the ones that were leading them in the wrong direction. And it takes time, wisdom, and the investment of setting aside time and energy to begin to discern and prayerfully understand what it is we're listening to and what it is that comes from God. I think I've remarked before that in Mark's Gospel it's interesting that Jesus is described as being among the wild beasts with angels ministering to him. So we have this sort of dichotomy between the beasts perhaps representing our physical, very earthly nature, and the angels representing the divine nature. And there's that sense in which we are somehow a mix of the two, not necessarily in what's called a dualistic way, a battle between the two. As humans, we are this psychosomatic unity, to use the technical term, that body and spirit are wound together. But we need to be aware of the different calls of each and the different ways in which we may be tempted to listen spiritually, or indeed to the body, as it were, and its desires, and how we deal with what it confronts us with, that mixture of the earthly and the divine. The wilderness gives us training, in a sense, to confront both and to discern what those demands are, so that we can understand what governs us and motivates us in our own response to God. So to go back to that image I gave you at the start, for me a very powerful image, that Jesus, as he's being nailed to the cross, is there with wood and nails and mallet, the things that would have been so commonplace to his early life, here being used as instruments of torture. But as the person who was leading that way of the cross reminded us, Jesus, despite this horrible transformation, was able to look at those who were torturing him, to look at them in love and in forgiveness. He was able to look beyond the anger, to look beyond their indifference, perhaps. He was just another Jewish victim as far as the Romans were concerned. He was just someone else who'd done something wrong, a nuisance to be got out of the way. He was the victim of their casual cruelty. And yet, as with that delightful story of Jesus encountering the young man who can't really give up his wealth, we're told Jesus looked at him and loved him. And we can sense that he'd be doing the same, as indeed he goes on to ask the Father's forgiveness for those who have tortured him. And that ability to do that, even in the most extreme of situations, must have been born from a constant recentering on the Father, on a recentering on God's love, on the habit of listening to the Father's voice, on the sense of experiencing the Father's love day by day. So as we make our journey, and this fourth Sunday of Lent, Laetare Sunday, we're looking forward with a degree of celebration to Easter itself. As we begin to emerge from the wilderness, it's perhaps good to pray that our experience in the wilderness is indeed one that transforms us, that equips us to deal with the challenges we face beyond. However dark the experience of the wilderness, it may only be a very small taste of some of the challenges that faced us beyond. And that's why it's good to have this discipline, this sense of using Lent as a time for our training spiritually, as our Lord himself does in the wilderness.